Deep Purple in Rock has been called one of heavy metal's defining albums. AllMusic's Eduardo Rivadavia said that. Not some rando on Reddit. This is a respected music publication. Ritchie Blackmore has been called one of the founding fathers of heavy metal. Every shredder from Yngwie Malmsteen to Randy Rhoads traces a line back to him. So how can I possibly tell you Deep Purple isn't metal? Well, because everything around the guitars says so. This is the first in a series where I'm going to strip away every label people have stuck on Deep Purple Mark II. Prog, metal, hard rock, every one of them. And by the end, I'm going to tell you what they actually were. We're starting with metal because it's the most obvious argument to take apart. And honestly, it's the most fun. The surface evidence is strong. Nobody's denying that. But metal isn't just a sound. It's an identity, a commitment, a worldview. And that's where Purple falls apart as a metal band, in every direction you look. But to make this argument, I need to define metal properly, not as a caricature, as what it actually is to the people who play it and live it. Because if I build a straw man here, you'll tear me apart in the comments, and you'd be right to. Metal is more than loud guitars and heavy riffs. Reducing it to that would be doing exactly what I'm arguing people do to Purple, being reductive. Metal has dynamic range, it has melody, it has musicians with jazz and classical training, it has bands as diverse as Sabbath, Iron Maiden, Metallica, and Opeth. You can't draw a simple sonic box around it. But there is something that holds across all of metal, from the earliest Sabbath album to whatever came out last week. And I think it's this. Metal is a total commitment, sonic, aesthetic, and cultural. It's an identity. Metal takes itself seriously, whether it's Sabbath's Doom, Maiden's historical epics, Metallica's social fury, or Opeth's existential weight. The tone is earnest. Metal means it. There's a gravity to the lyrics, the imagery, the presentation that says, this matters. We're not messing about. And metal speaks to outsiders. It always has. Dina Weinstein, probably the most respected academic voice on metal culture, describes metal fans as forming an exclusionary youth community that is distinctive and marginalized from the mainstream. From the working class kids in Birmingham who invented to the global community it became, metal is tribal, us against the mainstream, us against people who don't understand. That's why metal fans are the most loyal fans in music. And then there's the aesthetic, the visual commitment. Sabbath had the occult, inverted crosses, doom imagery. Priest had leather and studs and hellfire. Maiden had Eddie. The album art, the stage design, the logos, the merchandise, it all pulls in the same direction as the music. Darkness, power, intensity. The look matches the sound, and it's a complete world. So metal is sonic commitment to heaviness as the center of gravity, aesthetic commitment to a visual world that matches, and cultural commitment to seriousness, outsider identity, and tribal belonging. The sound, the look, the lyrics, and the attitude all pull in the same direction. That's the standard, not a caricature. It's not a loud and dumb thing. It's a complete, committed identity. Now think about Deep Purple. 5 guys who look like they happen to be in a band. Yeah, Blackmore had flair. He was a showman. But it was rock star flair, not metal iconography. There's no leather pentagrams, no visual mythology, no darkness. And the rest of them, well, they look like they just wandered in from the pub. The album artwork tells the story. On In Rock, the band's faces are carved into Mount Rushmore. That's cheeky. That's irreverent. That's 5 guys having a laugh. Machine Head is a minimal, almost abstract design. There's no dark imagery anywhere in the Mark II catalog. And Gillan's lyrics? He's writing about driving fast, women, being on the road, a casino that burned down, even Child in Time, the most intense, serious piece, is an anti-war statement. It's political, it's not gothic. It's human, not mythological. Were Deep Purple outsiders? Were they speaking to and for people on the margins? They were having hit singles, they were mainstream and massive, and playing to whoever showed up. There was no tribe, no us against them, no cultural identity to belong to. And the attitude? In 1979, Blackmore said, and this is a direct quote, "I like popular music like ABBA very much. There's so much stigma like, you can't do this because you're in a heavy band, and I think that's just rubbish." And that wasn't just talk. During the recording of Rainbow's Long Live Rock and Roll, Cozy Powell confessed to Blackmore and Ronnie James Dio that he liked ABBA. Blackmore said he loved ABBA. Dio said he did too. And the three of them, the man in black, the voice of Holy Diver, and one of rock's hardest-hitting drummers, spent the rest of the evening in a French chateau playing ABBA records instead of writing songs. Blackmore later called ABBA probably my favorite band of all time. That's not a metal attitude. That's a musician who refuses to be boxed in. And there's a looseness, a sense of humor about Purple that is genuinely incompatible with metal's earnestness. These were five guys having a laugh and a jam who happened to be brilliant. The heaviness was real, but it wasn't a statement. It just came out of what they wanted to play. But let's get to the music, because this is where the argument becomes bulletproof. Ian Paice grew up on big band jazz. His father was a pianist in a swing dance band, and that music was always on the record player. His heroes were Gene Krupa and Buddy Rich. He's been described as a rocker raised on jazz. He performed at Ronnie Scott's. His drumming style is a fusion of jazz phrasing within hard rock, triplet-based grooves, swing feel, dynamics that shift and breathe. He told Roger Glover, "I lead, I don't follow." And Paice himself said, "If you are a drummer, you should be able to play along with any style, whether it's jazz, rock, or orchestral. For me, playing was never a conscious thing. I just did it." That's not a metal drummer talking. That's a musician who refuses to be defined by one genre. Now, someone's already starting to type a comment about Bill Ward, and fair enough. Bill Ward was a jazz fan too. Same influences. Buddy Rich, Gene Krupa. He brought swing to early Sabbath. You can hear it clearly on the first couple of albums. War Pigs had a jazz waltz section. The Paranoid Shuffle had a swing feel. So if jazz drumming disqualifies Purple from metal, why doesn't it disqualify Sabbath? Here's why. Because Sabbath had a trajectory. As they got heavier, the metal identity solidified. Ward's jazz instincts were gradually overridden by what the band needed him to be. The swing was almost audible in the early transitional period. But by the mid-70s, the genre was demanding something different from the drummer. Metal tamed the swing. Metal never tamed Ian Paice, because Deep Purple's process, and this is crucial, was built on jamming. Ian Gillan described it. Everything emerges from jam sessions. We start at noon every day and finish at 6, day after day. That process required Pace's jazz instincts every time they walked into the studio or onto the stage. The band didn't have a predetermined identity for him to serve. He was free to lead, to swing, to react, and the music depended on it. Same background, opposite outcomes. Ward played jazz despite of the direction Sabbath was heading. Paice played jazz because of the way Purple worked. One drummer was gradually contained by the genre, the other was liberated by its absence. And Glover underneath him, self-described simple bass player. His advice to any young bass player? Find 3 brilliant musicians and hang on tight. He anchored, locked in, gave Paice the foundation to swing from. Together they created something that metal's rhythm section model simply didn't allow. A conversation between bass and drums, rather than a unified wall of sound. Listen to Black Knight. The cross-rhythmic triplet drum patterns is a jazz figure dropped into a rock song. Listen to Demon's Eye, Never Before, Maybe I'm a Leo. There's a groove in those songs, a feel that comes from Paice's jazz roots and John Lord's R&B background. Lord spent his early career in the Artwoods, a mod R&B band, playing Jimmy Smith-style organ in jazz clubs. He said himself, "We're all jazzers, really. You can't play those songs with a metal rhythm section. The feel would be destroyed." So the rhythm section doesn't fit, the look doesn't fit, the lyrics don't fit, the cultural identity doesn't fit, the attitude doesn't fit. Now, but what about Blackmore? Here's the distinction that matters. Influence isn't identity. Blackmore's influence on metal is undeniable and massive. Every shredder acknowledges it. But that influence flowed in one direction, out of Purple into metal. That doesn't make Purple a metal band. It makes metal one of Purple's descendants. And Blackmore's actual playing tells a different story than one metal claims. He said it himself. Most bands around that time were all influenced by the blues, but I was influenced by classical music. The Highway Star solo uses a Bach chord progression. The Burns solo uses Baroque arpeggios. His instinct was always to drive and cut with melody, not to crush with weight. Compare that to Tony Iommi. Iommi's playing is built on weight, doom, repetition. The riff is the identity. Blackmore's playing is built on melody, speed, and classical structure. He could hit hard, and of course he did, but his center of gravity was just completely different. Metal took Blackmore's aggression and speed, and it left behind the melody and his restlessness, his refusal to commit to one sound. It took the teeth and left the rest of the animal. That's extraction, not identity. Canadian journalist Martin Popoff put it well. He acknowledged that In Rock remains the sharpest, most insistently metallic Deep Purple record, but then noted that Deep Purple never accepted the metal title, fancying themselves as a jazzy, proggy, hard rock band. Even the band knew. They knew they weren't metal. Everyone else just wasn't listening. Okay, let's look at a couple songs. Child in Time. There's a quiet organ figure. Gillan enters softly. It builds slowly, painfully, through one of the most devastating vocal performances in rock. It reaches a shattering crescendo. Then it comes back down. Now I know what you're thinking. Plenty of metal bands use dynamics. Metallica has quiet intros. Opeth has entire acoustic passages. And you're right, metal can absolutely do light and shade. But here's the difference. In metal, the quiet part serves the heavy parts. They exist to make the heaviness hit harder. The quiet is a setup. The heavy is the payoff. The center of gravity is always weight. Child in Time doesn't work like that. The quiet isn't a setup for the heavy. The quiet is the song. The dynamic journey is the point. Light to dark to light again. Heaviness is one stop on that journey, not the destination. That's a fundamentally different relationship with intensity than metal has. Speed King gets cited as proto-metal constantly, but listen to what it actually is. Gillan's lyrics are lifted from Little Richard, Good Golly Miss Molly, Tutti Frutti. The riff is built from Hendrix songs, Fire and Stone Free. Glover said it plainly. We just took rock and roll and turned it into a song. Speed King isn't a blueprint for Judas Priest. It's Little Richard at 100 miles an hour. The DNA is rock and roll, not metal. Lazy, Never Before, Demon's Eye, Maybe I'm a Leo. These are songs with groove, songs with swing, songs with R&B feel in the rhythm section. These aren't deep cuts or anomalies. They're core tracks from some of the biggest Mark II albums. That's what the band sounded like when 5 musicians jammed honestly. And there's no world in which a metal band would produce them. Smoke on the Water. I can't avoid this one. One of the most famous riffs in history. It's heavy, It's iconic. But listen to the song, not the riff. The song. Listen to what Paice does underneath. Listen to the verses. Listen to Lord's organ. And listen to the space in the arrangement. It's a rock song with a heavy riff. Metal bands cover it and make it sound like metal. And that's the whole point. They've extracted the heaviness from a rock context and dropped it into a metal one. The riff survives the transplant because great riffs are versatile, but the organism it grew in wasn't metal. Taking one element from Purple and building a genre around it, that's going to be like a running theme in this series. Deep Purple isn't heavy metal. The commitment isn't there. No dark aesthetic, no outsider identity, no earnest worldview of heaviness as a way of life. The attitude isn't there. Blackmore thought being boxed in was rubbish, calling ABBA probably his favorite band of all time. The rhythm section isn't there. Too much jazz, too much swing, too much conversation between the bass and drums. The guitar isn't there. It's too melodic, too restless to commit to one sound. The dynamic range isn't there. Too much light and shade with heaviness as one color rather than the whole palette. And the process isn't there. Everything in Purple emerged from jams. Metal requires you to know what you are before you walk into the room. Purple never knew what they were going to be, and that was the point. Metal took pieces of Deep Purple and built something magnificent with them. But pieces aren't the whole. So, Deep Purple is not metal. But if they're not metal, surely the prog?